Hello and welcome everyone. This is the fourth module of our Train the Trainer program, where we will dive into step 3, land, of our SBTN target setting process. My name is Paul Olawale Johnson and I work with the SBTN team supporting corporate engagement. As we move through the curriculum, you'll hear from some expert partners. These companies have played a key role in co-developing our methods with us, and also supported countless companies in its implementation. The lessons learned and insights they will bring during the course of this session will help bring this training to life. Now let's get started. On today's session, we will take a deep dive into step 3, land, mastering the basics, under which we will look at 1, the no conversion of natural ecosystem targets, 2, the land footprint reduction targets. We'll also look at the landscape engagement targets, and finally, we will guide you on how to get ready for validation and disclosure. We'll also share with you some key takeaways and next steps, and of course, additional resources for your comprehension and benefits. Before we dive into step 3, land, let's do a quick recap of our Train the Trainer program and what we learned from module 3 and step 2. I'm also joined by Craig Beatty from the World Wildlife Fund, providing you and I with key insights to help us better understand and apply these targets effectively. A quick reminder, our Train the Trainer curriculum consists of 5 initial modules designed to guide you through the first 3 steps of the SBTN target setting process. We began with a general overview, which laid the foundation for engaging with this target setting process. From there, modules are meant to be completed in sequential order, ensuring a structured learning experience. Today, we are on module 4, where we will focus on step 3, land, and how it all fits into the 5-step target setting framework.
Hi there, my name is Craig Beatty and I work for World Wildlife Fund, United States, where I manage research and strategy for our major forest initiatives. For the past 5 years or so, we've worked at WWF and among many other organizations in partnership, including Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, World Resources Institute, the Food and Land Use Coalition with support from Systemic, and many, many more, to put together the series of targets that we're going to talk about today. A lot of what you're going to hear in this session is going to sound scripted, and that's because a lot of it is. It's really important to both us and to SBTN and the companies and organizations that are going to use this guidance that we get this right. So if it seems a little stiff, that's why. This module will help you achieve 5 objectives to support you in mastering the basics of Step 3, land, and how it fits into the overall SBTN framework. It'll also help you understand which of the 3 land targets must be set and help you prepare the data and calculations for the definitions as well as their eventual validation and disclosure. At the end of this module, you should be able to answer most of the common questions regarding the SBTN land targets. So now let's get into the actual content of this module. Step 3, land, mastering the basics. Our first objective is to understand why it's important for companies to assess and manage their impacts on land, to explore the 3 SBTN land targets, and to learn how they fit into the overall SBTN methodology. At the core of SBTN's tools, methods, and guidance for setting nature targets is the 5-step framework that allows companies to assess their impacts on specific pressures on nature, identify where to focus efforts and on what components of the business, and to set targets that align with what nature needs, the first 3 steps that you see here. Of course, this is followed by action and results in step 4 and 5, which are not a part of this section. Two unique aspects of the SBTN approach are first, that these targets are spatially explicit, reflecting the needs of nature where company pressures occur, and second, that actions are guided by the SBTN's mitigation hierarchy: avoid, reduce, regenerate, restore, and transform. SBTN land targets represent a significant portion of Step 3 in this framework. It provides the guidelines for companies to set location-specific and science-based targets for land. In a separate module, we'll cover Step 3 for freshwater. This module will allow you to determine which land targets a company should set and how setting land targets works. As mentioned earlier, the land methods cover 3 targets: no conversion of natural ecosystems, land footprint reduction, and landscape engagement. Overall, after completing Step 3, land, you'll be able to articulate how a company determines the land targets it is responsible to set, to clarify the data requirements for setting each of the 3 land targets, and to generate land targets for a company based on the SBTN land guidance. Before setting land targets, companies must determine the land targets they have a responsibility for under the SBTN. This considers a combination of the following criteria depending on the target. First, their material pressures. First, their material pressures on terrestrial ecosystem use and change or soil pollution as determined by using the Step 1 guidance from SBTN. Second, the sector or sectors to which the company belongs as defined by the United Nations International Standard Industrial Classification of All Economic Activities, or ISIC. For companies that are not familiar with ISIC, there are several helpful industry classification crosswalks available so they know how they're classified. And finally, the size of the company as measured by full-time equivalent employees, which applies only to the land footprint reduction target. If a company is not required to set a land footprint reduction target, then they do not need to use this information in setting land targets. Now, let's look more specifically at how to determine which targets to set. Here, I'd like to start with a target that applies most broadly to companies setting science-based targets for land. If a company in Step 1 identifies either soil pollution or terrestrial ecosystem use and change as material, they're required to set the landscape engagement target. This means that if a company is setting a science-based target for land, they will end up engaging in at least one landscape where their operations or supply chain touch the world. Even if a company is not required to set a landscape engagement target, SBTN still recommends that all companies consider engaging in landscape scale work with other stakeholders. Moving to the other targets, a company must set a no conversion of natural ecosystems target if terrestrial ecosystem use or change is material according to Step 1's materiality screening, or if 20% or more of their greenhouse gas emissions come from a sector that generates land use change emissions, for example, agriculture, forestry, and other land-intensive sectors. Here we can note that this target is consistent with the zero deforestation commitments and the Accountability Framework Initiative guidance. Therefore, this target is especially relevant for companies with existing deforestation and conversion-free commitments. Finally, a company will need to set a land footprint reduction target if all of these following criteria apply. First, terrestrial ecosystem use or change is material according to Step 1A's materiality screening. And second, the company produces or sources agricultural products, as in it is included in the land footprint reduction List A in Figure 2. And third, under the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Climate, the company is required to set an SBTI forest, land, and agriculture target, or FLAG target. Finally, one or both of the following conditions applies. A company has a baseline agricultural land footprint of more than 50,000 hectares as calculated using Chapter 7 of the Draft Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance. Or B, the company has 10,000 or more full-time equivalent employees. Finally, to determine if a company is required to set a landscape engagement target, this will depend on 1, whether terrestrial ecosystem use or change or soil pollution are material, according to the materiality screening in Step 1A. Even if a company determines that its landscape engagement target is not required, SBTN still recommends that companies set this target. Here, we have a little more detail on the purpose and intended outcomes of these land targets. One question that we often get is about setting one of these targets, but not others. The SBTN mitigation hierarchy rationale underpinning these targets, that AR3T, asks companies to address their impacts and contribute to restorative and transformative actions. For this reason, it is not possible for companies to exclude land targets from their commitments should they determine that the land target is required. Although it is required that companies set all targets for which they are responsible, the target dates will differ among or within the 3 targets, which we will get to in greater detail in just a bit. The suite of land targets in version 1 defines and operationalizes a consistent path for companies that will align their commitments and actions with what nature needs. Regarding the purpose of each target individually, the no conversion of natural ecosystems target avoids land use change, the primary driver of terrestrial biodiversity loss and a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Note that the target dates for achieving the no conversion requirements are for the combined objective of no deforestation and no conversion together, and this requirement is aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative, Science-Based Targets Initiative flag requirements, and the European Union's deforestation regulation. For Target 2 on land footprint reduction, this target reduces the area or intensity of agricultural production, one of the most globally persistent and highly degrading processes impacting biodiversity, climate, and land. Finally, Target 3 on landscape engagement puts company action and effort in the places where they operate or from which they know they source conversion-driving commodities. Importantly, this target puts these actions in the context of multi-objective landscape scale initiatives and will align with what stakeholders determine is needed to improve social and ecological conditions in these places. Now that we've explained the basic requirements and considerations of the SBTN land targets, let's dive into each of these targets individually to get to know them in more detail, starting with our first target, no conversion of natural ecosystems. As with each of the other targets, there are 5 key tasks to consider in setting a no conversion of natural ecosystems target. First, you'll need to identify the pathways your company needs to follow to comply with the no conversion method. This is based both on a company's operational footprint as well as the types of commodities included at different stages of a company's value chain. Annex 1A of the land guidance includes 2 tables of conversion-driving commodities. If a company produces or sources these commodities and they are within the materiality thresholds included in Step 1, knowledge and information around these commodities will be central in understanding how to set a no conversion target. Preparing your baseline data starts with identifying your direct operations or production areas for any conversion-driving commodity production, and also includes the location of your operations and infrastructure as well. These areas should then be assessed for any conversion of natural land since 2020 or earlier cutoff dates if they are already part of deforestation or conversion-free commitments, using the SBTN Natural Lands Map. Commodities for which you have traceability within your value chain to the production unit should also be assessed against the Natural Lands Map. For Annex 1A commodities that are part of your upstream value chain, there are several additional options for how to include these in the no conversion target that we'll address a little bit later. In addition, you'll consider the origin of the commodities using the list of conversion hotspots defined at the level of subnational jurisdictions. This will enable you to prioritize locations that may have accelerated target dates for no conversion and will help you to determine the approach for setting phased targets based on where these commodities sit in your value chain. Finally, once data is ready, you'll be able to submit the target for validation. Following approval from validation services, your company will be able to publicly disclose the target in line with SBTN's claims guidance. We can now look a little bit deeper into the tasks. You'll start by assessing which pathways your company will need to follow to comply with the no conversion requirements. Sectors that must set a no conversion target, but who belong to the list of MICE sectors, mining, infrastructure, construction, and extractives, which are listed in Figure 1 of the Land Guidance, must commit to no conversion of areas identified through the International Finance Corporation's Performance Standard 6, which we shorten by saying IFC PS 6. Within this environmental assessment process, companies assess the existence of critical habitats using the guidelines within this standard. Alternatively, since IFC PS6 can be extremely difficult for companies with large numbers of sites, these companies may identify core natural lands for no conversion based on their overlap with key biodiversity areas and all classes of protected areas found within the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, or IBAT, as well as areas identified as critical habitat in a screening layer published by the United Nations Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center, or UNEP-WCMC. For all the other non-MICE sectors that must set this target, the no conversion requirements will differ depending on the type of commodity sourced, the origin of commodities, and the stage of the value chain in which the company operates and from which the commodities are sourced as presented in Table 5 in the Land Guidance. For example, a company may follow requirements for volumes of conversion-driving commodities that are sourced directly from producers and follow different requirements when sourcing from the first point of aggregation of those commodities or other commodities. The final value chain stage in the SBTN Land Guidance allows even more flexibility for commodities that are sourced from downstream of the first point of commodity aggregation, each of which are defined in Annex 1B of the SBTN Land Guidance. As a next step, you'll prepare baseline data for this target. Spatial data is required for direct operation, while the minimum level of traceability for conversion-driving commodities must be at least to the first administrative division at a subnational level. This applies to sourced volumes of conversion-driving commodities that are in scope. While in Step 1 and Step 2, companies were able to move through the workflow using data collected at different levels of traceability, for example, at the global or national level, companies can only advance with preparing baseline data for SBTN land targets with volumes of conversion-driving commodities that are traceable to at least the subnational level. For all other volumes, companies will engage the supply chain to enhance traceability and will increase the percentage of volumes in compliance with deforestation and conversion-free requirements in line with traceability requirements and their target dates. In more detail, the requirements for commodity producers, site owners, and site operators are different from the requirements of those sourcing conversion-driving commodities from upstream of their own operations or outside of their control. For producers, site owners, and operators, these must first demarcate all production units and all operational areas with georeferenced boundaries, as in polygons, with the exception of small sites that are less than 10 hectares, for which one point coordinate near the center of production is sufficient. Second, they must locate these sites within the natural lands map. Third, they track any natural ecosystem conversion at each production unit level since the cutoff date, using land use, land cover change data from the cutoff year to the target setting date, year 0. They check if land cover change occurred on natural lands. And finally, they establish a no conversion target for all production units and operational areas. For those sourcing conversion-driving commodities, they must first identify the origin of all material conversion-driving commodities, those listed in Annex 1A of the methods, down to the production unit or sourcing area. Second, they determine the percentage of commodity volumes that meet deforestation and conversion-free requirements. And third, for volumes that are not yet traceable to the production unit or to the sourcing area, companies must work with the supply chain to improve traceability and increase compliance with deforestation and conversion-free requirements according to traceability requirements and target dates, while keeping the volumes in target boundary B as traceability enhances. In the next step, companies must measure and account for land use change in credible and consistent ways to effectively progress towards the achievement of targets to end deforestation and conversion from operations and supply chains. This process is also key to accounting for land use change emissions in setting SBTI flag targets. And companies that have already completed this process in their SBTI flag targets will find this step much simpler. As a reminder, when using the term land use change, we align with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's accounting guidance and refer to it as synonymous with conversion and terrestrial ecosystem change. Many terms for the loss of terrestrial ecosystems. Companies can account for conversion using two methods that are illustrated in the following sections. Assessment of conversion at the production unit level, which requires full traceability and spatial data associated with specific commodity production and sourcing. The assessment of conversion at the sourcing area level, which requires traceability at least at the subnational level. The requirements for assessing conversion and the date by which the assessment must cover all volumes included in the target boundaries A and B are summarized in Table 7 of the Land Guidance. When accounting at the production unit level, companies should use the SBTN Natural Lands Map to identify which parts of land use change are a permanent conversion of natural ecosystems. In some cases, such as extensively managed forestry, harvesting of timber is not a permanent conversion event. When accounting at the sourcing area level, use only the available methods on the next slide to allocate conversion. When accounting at the sourcing area level, use one of the available methods on the next slide to allocate conversion to the volumes of conversion-driving commodities sourced from that area. Companies can account for conversion by using assessments at the production unit level and at the sourcing area level. For the production unit level assessment, this tracks conversion directly at the specific production unit, like farms or mines, and requires detailed traceability and spatial data. The definition of production unit is adapted from the Accountability Framework Initiative and is included in the glossary at the beginning of the Land Guidance. Production units must be demarcated by georeference boundaries. For smaller sites, those less than 10 hectares, a single coordinate with a 12.75 hectare circular buffer is sufficient. This buffer equates to a 200-meter radius around the coordinate. As for what to include, companies will need to track all deforestation and conversion that happened since the cutoff date, regardless of the land's current use. This means including conversion whether the land is now used for producing the same or a different commodity, is not used yet, or is currently not in use. For companies using the sourcing area level assessment, conversion is being estimated for the broader sourcing area, such as a production landscape or at an entire subnational jurisdiction, instead of specific production units. As such, the traceability needed must be at the minimum the subnational level. This could be a radius from a collection point, a defined production landscape, or an entire subnational jurisdiction. This approach is useful if physical traceability to the production unit is not yet available. If the sourcing area is a better scale for managing deforestation and conversion risks, or if sourcing is from areas where recent conversion has not yet occurred. When assessing land use change at the sourcing area level, there is a need to include all conversion related to agriculture, including crops and livestock, forestry, and hard commodities relevant to the sectors involved. Commodities and volumes that can only be traced to a country of their origin, or if they are unknown, will be classified in Target Boundary B. As for how to use or combine these, companies should keep the calculations for sourcing and production levels separate. If they have enough traceability to calculate conversion at a production unit level, they do not have to harmonize with levels of statistical conversion. A company should always aim to use higher level of traceability available for assessing conversion and disaggregate the volumes according to the level of traceability. The determination of the appropriate scale of analysis will largely depend on the ability of the company to trace products through the supply chain to their origin, as well as the extent to which that origin is associated with the risk of deforestation or ecosystem conversion, and the appropriate scale of management given the context of producing and sourcing a commodity. Before showcasing how to do this in practice, it's also important to understand the parallel process for calculating land use change emissions in SBTI flag, from which we can distinguish direct and statistical land use change. This guidance can be found in the SBTI flag guidance. This section provides a hypothetical example of how Ursus nourishment sets targets for land-related pressures at sites prioritized in Step 2. The example focuses on one upstream commodity, soy, sourced in Argentina. For context, and if you remember from Step 1, Ursus Nourishment is a food and beverage producer that specializes in plant-based drinks and food. The company's activities range from crop production, processing of raw commodities, and packaging of finished goods. They purchase major commodities including almonds, cocoa, corn, soybean, timber in the form of paperboard, as well as other ingredients such as sugar from sugarcane and other additives. Based on the land guidance, Ursus must set targets for no conversion of natural ecosystems, land footprint reduction, and landscape engagement, all three targets. Within Step 2, Ursus used information it has on land use and land use change to determine which areas were in scope for their land targets. The team is aware that no conversion target must include all locations and activities within their direct operations target boundary and upstream target boundary A, to avoid leakage of conversion to other locations within the company's sphere of control or influence. These target boundaries were already determined in Step 2, so the team refers to their previous work to determine which areas are in scope for their no conversion target. From Step 2, for its direct operations, the company defined its target boundaries. It identified all 5 sites with pressures on land use and land use change in Belgium, France, Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom, and all activities included within these basins, within each of those countries, production, manufacturing, and packaging. For sourced volumes of conversion-driving commodities, see Table 6 and Table 8 in Step 1's case study, The URSUS team was not able to confirm the sourcing locations for timber and sugarcane purchases during the time frame of the assessment. So it marked those volumes and estimated locations within its target boundary B. This means that the commodities in target boundary B comprise 30.3% of URSUS's total purchased volumes. But since at least 50% of all upstream activities are captured in target boundary A, the company is able to meet SBTN's recommendation that more than 0% of all upstream activities are captured in target boundary A. URSUS referred to Table 4 in the Land Technical Guidance to understand the data requirements and needed submissions for setting the no conversion target. URSUS focused on one upstream activity, soy from Argentina, and the team must first identify whether that sourcing location is located in a conversion hotspot. Companies sourcing conversion-driving commodities must prioritize efforts to stop conversion in the so-called conversion hotspots. This prioritization is geographically reflected in the list of conversion hotspots as subnational jurisdictions and is further prioritized by assigning these areas earlier target dates for demonstrating no conversion. These hotspots highlight areas with high conversion rates between 2000 and 2020, and therefore need more urgent action to prevent further conversion due to commodity production and sourcing. To do so, companies will follow two steps. First, they will start with a spatial prioritization to identify conversion hotspots where no conversion efforts should be focused first, which may not have been fully covered in the prioritization of Step 2. Note that this prioritization does not technically apply to producers, site owners, or site operators, as they already have accelerated target dates. But it is recommended that conversion hotspots draw early attention for this stage of the value chain as well. In addition, companies following the MICE pathway will instead prioritize action in critical habitats or core natural lands as previously explained, though where these overlap with conversion hotspots would certainly confer some additional recommended prioritization. Companies will apply the conversion hotspots prioritization to the sourcing of the following commodities: soy, cattle, oil palm, wood, cocoa, coffee, and rubber. This step is in addition to the spatial prioritization completed in Step 2. Companies will then assess target requirements and target dates. Producers and first points of aggregation sourcing must ensure 100% conversion-free sourcing of soy, cattle, oil palm, wood, cocoa, coffee, and rubber from natural forests and conversion hotspots by the end of 2025 and by 2027 for all other conversion-driving commodities in all natural lands. For companies sourcing further downstream from the first point of aggregation, they must eliminate ecosystem conversion for 100% of soy, cattle, oil palm, wood, cocoa, coffee, and rubber volumes associated with natural forests by the end of 2025 and ensure conversion-free sourcing for these commodities in conversion hotspots by 2027. Additionally, companies shall achieve 100% conversion-free sourcing for all other conversion-driving commodities across all natural lands by 2030. As mentioned earlier, companies will need to use the SBTN Natural Lands Map to estimate ecosystem conversion and to obtain the necessary data to baseline a 2020 cutoff for no conversion calculations. Sourcing companies may also use statistical methods for the assessment of conversion as alternative to the assessments performed through the use of the Natural Lands Map. The approach to be used depends on the position of conversion-driving commodities in the supply chain and the traceability data that is available for these commodities. If you are a producer or a project site owner or operator, first gather data on your production units and any land conversion that occurred after the 2020 baseline, following the guidelines in Section 2, Data Requirements to Set Land Targets. Next, compare the collected data with the SBTN Natural Lands Map to determine if the converted land is a natural ecosystem or non-natural land. Next, report any conversion of natural ecosystems to SBTN. And finally, address any ecosystem conversion that occurred after 2020 according to the forthcoming remediation guidance. If you are a sourcing company, first, you'll collect data on the origin of the conversion-driving commodities that you source, whether at the level of production units or sourcing areas outlined in Section 2's Data Requirements to Set Land Targets. Next, if you have spatial data from production units, use the map as producers do. If relying on sourcing area data, follow statistical land use change methods to estimate conversion. And finally, determine how much conversion of natural land occurred in the production units in your supply chain and use the accounting guidance for statistical allocation of conversion for the volumes that you source. Now let's get back to our case study. Ursus is a company that sources from a stage downstream of the first point of aggregation. As for all sourcing companies, the minimum level of traceability required for setting the target is at a subnational level. In this case, the sourcing location is indicated by the red locator mark in Figure 1. It's indicative of the general region where the soy was produced, but does not provide traceability to production unit. To understand which no conversion target date applies, the team must first identify the origin of soy sourced from Argentina. They determined that the soy sourcing location was in the Pampas region, which is known for its recent expansion of soy farming. Ursus checked if the Pampas region was a conversion hotspot using Figure 6 in the Land Technical Guidance and determined that it was. This meant that they needed to prioritize no conversion efforts in this region, and it means that these commodity volumes will have a 2027 no conversion target date. By the end of 2027, Ursus must demonstrate that its sourcing from this subnational region is not associated with the conversion of natural land. Companies that set a target of no conversion of natural ecosystems will be required to address conversion that occurs between 2020 and the target date by which they will have conversion-free operations and supply chains. After the target date, only minimal levels of conversion can occur without the company falling out of compliance with the target requirements, which is in line with the minimum requirements outlined in the SBTN land guidance. Post-cutoff date conversion and any residual minimal conversion will have to be remediated as indicated by the remediation guidance, which is still in development. In the meantime, some preliminary steps you should expect include assessing conversion of natural lands as part of Step 3 or Step 4 of the SBTN process, defining the area and geography of converted natural lands to be remediated, third, selecting remediation locations, and submitting documentation on remediation of conversion to SBTN. But what does remediation imply? Remediation aims to restore or regenerate a comparable area of lost ecosystems as equivalently as possible, and it's not designed or intended to offset future conversion of natural ecosystems. A reminder, SBTN does not recognize offsets as compliant within its frameworks. With the focus on restoring or regenerating a comparable area of lost ecosystems, there are options available that cover a range of different geographic and operational scenarios, with options 1 to 3 listed in order of priority ahead of options 4 and 5. Recognizing that within the context of remediation, it is likely that companies may deploy any number of these 5 scenarios. The key distinction across the first 3 options is that the first focusing on the remediation through the ecological restoration of ecosystems that were converted in the exact area that was converted after 2020. Whereas the second best option focuses on a portion of the exact area that was converted after 2020, with the remaining required remediation area of ecological restoration in degraded areas directly adjacent to the area of conversion. And the third alternative focuses on an equal area to the area converted after 2020 that is directly adjacent to the area that was converted. As for options 4 and 5, the fourth focuses on remediation actions in a portion of the overall area converted that is directly adjacent to the area of conversion, with the additional portion of the area of remediation requirements taking place in the area that is not directly adjacent to the conversion site. The fifth option looks at remediation in an equal area to the area converted after 2020, taking place in an area fully non-adjacent to the conversion area. In this scenario, companies must remediate within the landscape, ecosystem, or subnational jurisdiction where natural ecosystem conversion as a result of where their or a portion of their commodity sourcing was detected. The purchase of credits to satisfy the remediation requirement outside of the deployment of biodiversity credits as part of a multi-stakeholder landscape scale solution set is not permitted. Companies may not purchase biodiversity credits to comply with remediation requirements. As stated, preference should be given to the first scenario, and the fourth and fifth scenario should only be used when conditions permit their deployment and actions in line with scenarios 1 to 3 are not possible. In cases where the conversion area is not known, companies must decide which remediation requirements to apply. To determine the area a company is responsible for remediating, the SBTN Step 3 guidance offers guidance aligned with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the Accountability Framework Initiative for statistically allocating conversion that occurred in the subnational jurisdiction for the sourced volumes. As with traceability to the subnational level, linking specific sourcing volumes to exact areas of conversion is not possible. Given this limitation, SBTN asks of companies to incorporate the area that they are required to remediate into their multi-stakeholder-led landscape scale initiative as a commitment to ecological restoration in their landscape engagement target. Companies must remediate within the landscape, ecosystem, or subnational jurisdiction where natural ecosystem conversion occurred as a result of where their or a portion of their commodity sourcing was detected, and not in another landscape initiative in which the company may be engaged. Additional guidance around both the deployment of these 5 scenarios and around cases where multiple instances of natural ecosystem conversion occur as a result of sourcing multiple commodities from multiple subnational jurisdictions will be developed by SBTN and broadly consulted with the user and stakeholder community. URSIS now knows how much soy is coming from a region considered a conversion hotspot and for which a 2027 no conversion status must be achieved by looking at Table 5 of the technical guidance. Without better traceability, URSIS cannot determine what percentage of the sourcing volumes are already conversion-free. URSIS can determine a conversion-free status through one of the options available to companies, as explained in Section 1.3.4 of the Land Guidance. If none of the options are applicable for the time being, URSIS will consider all of these volumes as currently non-compliant. URSIS is aware that for soy sourced from a conversion hotspot, there is a requirement to assess post-cutoff date conversion by the end of 2025, as shown in Table 7. Requirements for the assessment of post-cutoff date conversion. URSUS can start assessing the levels of conversion associated with the volumes sourced from the region by using the statistical land use change methodology presented in section 1.3.3, or work on improving traceability through to the end of 2025 to production unit areas and determine any post-cutoff date conversion through the direct land use change methodology as presented in section 1.3.2. URSUS acknowledged the requirement to assess post-cutoff date conversion for soy sourced from a conversion hotspot by the end of 2025. For soy sourced from a conversion hotspot, there is a requirement to assess post-cutoff date conversion by the end of 2025. URSUS can assess conversion using the statistical land use change methodology or improve traceability to the production unit level by 2025 and use direct land use change. URSUS will continue to work for improving traceability in order to be able to prove by 2027 that the volumes sourced from the region are conversion-free after the applicable cutoff date, no later than 2020 in this example, and will define remediation plans for the levels of post-cutoff date conversion derived from the assessment that they just performed. The process taken for Argentina's soy will have to be completed for all other sourcing locations where URSUS is sourcing soy and other conversion-driving commodities. Congratulations! Now the target is defined. But how does a company ensure compliance with the target requirements? Detailed guidance on the implementation of actions to achieve targets will be released by SBTN as guidance on Step 4, Act, and Step 5, Track, of the SBTN methods. For now, here are different ways companies can assess compliance for the no conversion of natural ecosystems target. First, companies can trace commodities back to the production or processing units of origin and ensure that conversion events did not occur after the relevant cutoff date. Second, companies can trace commodities back to an intermediate supplier that itself has effective control mechanisms in place and can demonstrate the ability to trace its supplier to the production or processing units of origin and can demonstrate compliance with target requirements. Third, companies can utilize credible assurance systems, for example, credible certification systems based on a physical chain of custody, capable of linking raw material supplies with production units in compliance with target requirements. And finally, companies may trace materials to jurisdictions or landscapes where it has been demonstrated that conversion did not occur after the relevant cutoff date. The no conversion target was the most detailed and in-depth of the three targets. Based on the variability of companies, commodities, and supply chains, the complexity of that target is important to make sure that each company can set effective targets and that SBTN balances the urgency and ambition that underpin the loss of nature with the feasibility of companies to comply with such targets. We can take a breath now and move into how to support companies that are required to set a land footprint reduction target, which you may recall applies only to large agricultural companies or those that source large amounts of conversion-driving commodities. There are 4 key tasks a company will need to complete for setting a land footprint reduction target. First, the company will start by calculating its baseline agricultural footprint. Then, a company will select either the absolute or intensity approach for the allocation of their land footprint reduction. The company will then select a representative base year and a target year to advance the calculation of the land footprint reduction target. And finally, the company will submit its data for target validation. Let's now dive into the process for setting a land footprint reduction target. Please note again that this target applies only to large agricultural companies with large amounts of agricultural land. That means cropland and land under permanent meadows and pastures used to produce the products produced or sourced by a company. It does not apply to forest land. Agricultural sectors are the largest users of land, and several global models indicate that agricultural land footprint reduction is required to achieve global climate and nature targets. By contrast, there is a lack of scientific evidence on the extent to which other land-intensive sectors would need to reduce their land footprints. Subsequent versions of land targets will explore the applicability of this target setting methodology to other land uses, such as forestry. Companies can calculate their baseline agricultural land footprint by following the process described in the SBTN Technical Guidance for Step 1, Section 3, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, Sections 7.3 and 17.3 on land occupation in the draft guidance. Land occupation can be calculated using crop yields, for example, tons per hectare per year, to convert the amount produced to hectares, or by using land occupation factors, for example, square meters per kilogram, from life cycle assessment databases. In instances where the land area sourced from is known, and it is known that multiple products are produced on the land area each year, then an allocation approach may be necessary. Companies can use either mass or physical allocation, or they can use economic allocation, depending on which method better represents the relationship between the product and the amount of land used. For more guidance, you can refer to Chapter 8 of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's Corporate Value Chain Scope 3 Accounting and Reporting Standard, using land occupation instead of GHG, or emissions. To calculate the baseline agricultural land footprint, companies may need to collect spatial or statistical data. The calculation of baseline agricultural land footprint can be done with either spatial data or statistical data. Purchasing companies with an upstream agricultural land footprint will need statistical data on quantities of agricultural products sourced, locations in countries or regions if known, and yields in outputs per hectare for each product in each location if known. Producing companies with agricultural land use will need statistical data on quantities of agricultural products produced, and statistical or spatial data on the total area of land used for producing those products. When calculating the land footprint, if a company is using statistical data, it will need to calculate the land footprint for each product and add up the footprints for all products to get the total land footprint. The formula will read as land footprint in hectares is equal to quantity of product in metric tons over the yield of the product, metric tons per hectare per year. If using spatial data, companies will need to sum the hectares of all active agricultural production areas to estimate the total land footprint. In addition, we want to share some best practices to bear in mind when going through this process. First, use the most detailed available data and aim to improve data quality and traceability over time. Second, if product origin is unknown, use default assumptions like the same region as a company's headquarters and justify your selection to SBTN. For calculating land footprint of complex products, you can back calculate raw product amounts using formulas or recipe data. And if that's not possible, just use a reasonable assumption, for example, the primary or the top 3 ingredients, to estimate the land footprint. SBTN understands the complexities of land management and the need to balance social and environmental concerns. Therefore, if a company has a valid reason to exclude certain agricultural lands from the land footprint reduction target to preserve traditional livelihoods, SBTN will consider these requests on a case-by-case basis during the target validation phase. To review an exclusion, SBTN will ask for details including the number of hectares to be excluded, location, land use classification, agricultural products produced, production methods used, and information about the landowner or landowners and land managers. Additionally, the company must explain how excluding these lands will help preserve traditional livelihoods. A final clarification on waste, residual products, and non-timber forest products. For waste and residual products, if your company buys residual products or byproducts from other value chains, you should estimate the land footprint using an allocation method like mass or economic value. However, if you buy an agricultural product that is truly a waste product with no market value, you can exclude it from your land footprint reduction target. For non-forest timber products, if your company produces or sources non-timber forest products from land classified as forests, you can exclude these volumes from the land footprint calculation. This recognizes the positive role that low-impact harvesting of these products can play in adding economic value to standing forests. Now let's look at how URSUS went through the process of setting this target. URSUS understood that its business is impacting land use through its sourcing of cocoa, maize, soy, paperboard, sugar, and tree nuts. Based on Step 2 outputs, they know that their agricultural land footprint resides in their upstream impacts. In their base year of 2020, they sourced 165,500 metric tons of commodities as follows: cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, Ecuador, and Ghana, maize or corn from USA, paperboard from USA, soy from Argentina, Brazil, and India, sugar from Brazil and Sri Lanka, and tree nuts from Cote d'Ivoire, India, Spain, and the USA. URSUS identified yields of each commodity in each country and divided the quantity of each product sourced in 2020 by its yields to estimate its upstream agricultural land footprint. Based on this calculation, the team estimates that URSUS's agricultural land footprint totals 125,500 hectares across the different countries. Back to the methods. To set a land footprint reduction target, companies have two options, each having their own benefits and drawbacks, and therefore you should choose the one that best fits your company's needs and goals. The absolute reduction approach sets a target to reduce the total amount of land used. This target is easier to calculate and communicate and can more effectively lead to the reduction of overall global agricultural land use. On the other hand, absolute reduction in land use can limit growth, especially for smaller companies or those producing land-efficient products. The intensity reduction approach sets a target to reduce land use per unit of output, for example, by product or service. This approach suits companies focusing on sustainable productivity and helps smaller companies by allowing them to grow while still reducing land use intensity. However, this target is more complex to calculate and explain, and it does not guarantee that a company will reduce its total agricultural land footprint even if targets are met. Once you have selected the preferred allocation method, there are other vital considerations to think about before setting your target. There is a need to select a base year and the duration of the target. You should choose a base year no earlier than 2015, and please note that it does not have to match the cutoff date used for the no conversion of natural ecosystems target. As a recommendation, pick a year that reflects your typical operations. Avoid years heavily affected by events like the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of target duration, targets must cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 10 years from when you submit them to SBTN for validation. If you use an intensity reduction target, for example, reducing land use intensity by 1% per year, you also need to state the target in absolute terms. In addition, you should aim to improve the quality of your data over time, especially as companies undergo changes. When significant internal changes happen, or if there are updates to the land targets, you should recalculate your baseline land footprint, even if the base and target years remain the same. Recalculations will be necessary when the company undergoes major structural changes, such as mergers, acquisitions, divestments, or changes in outsourcing. There are changes in calculation methods, improvements in data accuracy, or discovery of major errors. Or there are changes in the categories or activities included in the land footprint calculation. With that in mind, let's look at an example calculation. Imagine you aim to reduce your land use intensity by 8% by 2030 from a 2022 base year and expect 5% growth during this period. Your absolute reduction would then be 3.4%. With these target reductions in mind, we want to stress the importance of your relationship with your suppliers to achieve this target. Instead of switching to higher yielding suppliers to improve performance, companies should work with the current suppliers to improve over time. Shifting to more efficient suppliers can harm the livelihoods of existing suppliers and may not reduce global agricultural land demand if other buyers simply switch to the supplier that you left. Companies should refer to Annex 2B and SBTN Stakeholder Engagement Guidance to understand the potential impact of their actions on local stakeholders and how to support rights-based approaches in implementing the land footprint reduction target. So now let's look at how URSUS calculates the target. URSUS knows that the land footprint reduction target must cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 10 years from the date the target is submitted to SBTN for an official validation. URSUS decides to set a 10-year target to 2030 relative to the base year of 2020 and decides to use the absolute land footprint reduction approach to set the target. They chose the base year 2020 as it most closely represented an average production year for them. Given SBTI flag guidance recommends that companies follow a sector approach to flag climate targets, the team chooses to set an absolute land footprint reduction target instead of an intensity land footprint reduction target. URSUS is then able to set a land footprint reduction target using the absolute reduction approach with the standard 0.35% linear annual rate of reduction. Based off the template statement in Section 2.4 of the Technical Guidance, URSUS decides on the following commitment. URSUS commits to reduce absolute agricultural land footprint from direct operations and upstream impacts by 3.5% by 2030 from a 2020 base year. URSUS also uses the same approach to set a long-term 10.6% land footprint reduction target by 2050 relative to the base year 2020. And with this, we can move on to Target 3. Let's now learn how companies set a landscape engagement target, which between the three is the most novel to companies in its approach. Importantly, this target will connect a company's work on its operations and supply chains with place-based initiatives that regenerate and restore nature. There are 4 key tasks to complete for setting a landscape engagement target. Companies start by selecting the landscapes for engagement through 2 different selection approaches proposed. Then, companies commit to improve the ecological and social conditions on those landscapes, not by themselves, but as part of the collective actions necessary within a landscape, as defined by many different cooperating stakeholders, including the company itself. Companies will need to define an action plan to envision actions to be implemented within the landscape to improve their conditions. Companies should evaluate any potential negative social or environmental effects of the engagement and select appropriate indicators to track progress. Lastly, companies will prepare and submit data for target validation and, if approved, make a public statement following SBTN's claims guidance. But before diving back into the methods, let's understand what this target entails. The intention of guiding companies in their engagement into landscapes for the deployment of collective action is to enable regenerative, restorative, and transformational actions in those landscapes that are relevant for a company's operations or supply chains. The third land target therefore complements Target 1 and Target 2, which are focused on the avoidance and reduction of impacts. This trio of land targets incentivizes actions that span all categories of SBTN's AR3T framework. The importance of landscape scale engagement is that it allows for the consideration of multiple objectives of multiple stakeholders, including nature. Since most landscapes that are material to a company involve a matrix of different non-natural and natural land cover and use, a landscape scale engagement helps to determine larger scale impacts and dependencies among land use types and the stakeholders that rely on natural resources or processes. The target itself requires companies to engage in one landscape initiative that is equivalent to a 10% coverage of the company's estimated land impact area, or their footprint. Or companies may select 2 landscape scale initiatives, regardless of their size, as long as they are in a materially relevant landscape. For companies that are already investing in landscape initiatives, landscape engagement may provide a simplified, integrated framework for quantifying and recognizing such contributions. On the right-hand side of this slide, we show you the 4 steps to follow to kickstart this process, which includes the evaluation of the landscape you opt to prioritize and the commitment and development of an action plan to substantially improve the ecological and social conditions of a landscape. Companies can choose between 2 main approaches for prioritizing landscapes. Through Approach 1, companies select landscapes for engagement in connection with the SBTN Step 1 and 2, and in connection with the land footprint reduction target. This approach is more suitable for companies who have low levels of conversion in their operations or supply chains, and for those who have set a land footprint reduction target. Companies with significant amounts of conversion within their operations and supply chains are recommended to select landscape for engagement using Approach 2. So how do these approaches work? Approach 1, as we have just seen, is suitable for companies with low conversion levels. Companies can use steps 1 or 2 and the outputs of those processes to prioritize landscapes based on their pressures and rank landscapes based on the land use area and the state of natural ecosystems. Approach 1 is also suitable for companies with multiple targets across land, climate, or oceans. In this case, companies can combine their analyses and include priority water basins or climate impact areas in their landscape analysis to address multiple pressures to enable them to focus efforts to achieve broader impacts across SBTN targets. However, note that if following this approach, SBTN will ask that you clearly explain your coverage percentages and rationale. A lower coverage might be acceptable if it addresses multiple outcomes. Approach 2 is designed for companies with no conversion targets, where companies shall select landscape with high levels of conversion by identifying landscapes with significant ecosystem conversions since their cutoff date and shall collaborate with stakeholders, including producers, sourcing companies, and local communities, to support remediation and achieve their no conversion target as well. Independently from the approach selected, the same coverage rules apply. The key requirement is to aim for at least 10% of the land use area in a company's supply chain, with the adjustments for the production side companies making them higher versus demand side companies, which could be lower. If there is less than a 10% coverage, SBTN will ask that the company engages in at least 2 landscape scale initiatives, regardless of their size. Let's now see what our friends at URSUS have done to select landscapes for engagement. The URSUS team begins the process to select landscapes for engagement, which must be material to their operations or supply chains. URSUS decides to use approach 1, which uses the pressure estimates for land use in kilometers squared in combination with the measures of state of nature. The team notes that SBTN requires companies that set a land footprint reduction target to use the landscape engagement target to align lands removed from production with local or regional landscape scale initiatives, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification agendas over time to restore natural lands. With this lens, the URSUS team also considers their land footprint reduction scope in the prioritization process for determining where they would set a landscape engagement target. Starting with their direct operation sites, URSUS begins to assess landscapes based on where the company has the largest land footprint in the base year, 2020, and the highest biodiversity risk. To validate their findings from Step 1 and Step 2, the team plots each of URSUS's direct operations sites within WWF's biodiversity risk filter. The results show that direct operations sites in Germany, France, and Belgium are rated as having the highest biodiversity risk. Based on the assessment, using a combination of land use area and state of nature metrics, the team decides to prioritize their direct operations in Germany and France for the landscape engagement target. After having selected landscape for engagement, how do companies evaluate existing initiatives? For this purpose, SBTN proposes a maturity matrix developed in cooperation with several organizations, including CDP and ICL, to choose effective initiatives and ensure transparent reporting of company contributions. The maturity matrix provides a valuable framework for assessing the quality of disclosure data and enabling organizations implementing or supporting landscape initiatives to gain a better understanding of the minimal elements of what constitutes a credible disclosure of corporate engagements in landscape scale initiatives. This understanding is essential to determine the credibility and quality of the way that a corporate is engaging in landscape initiative. More broadly, the maturity matrix can guide company investment and action in landscape initiatives and stimulate the adoption of transparent reporting systems through which a company can demonstrate its contribution to the actions and processes that form the core of the initiative. So what are the key criteria for screening landscape initiatives using the maturity matrix? There are 4 criteria. First, the scale of the initiative. Second, the involvement of multiple stakeholder groups. Third, the presence of collective goals and actions negotiated between the stakeholder groups. And finally, the transparency of the initiative. Based on those answers to the criteria, the matrix defines 3 maturity levels. First, comprehensive means that this initiative meets all 4 criteria and is fully developed and can deliver sustainable results. It has strong conditions to maintain long-term outcomes. A partial maturity means that the initiative is still developing but shows progress, meets the scale criterion, and is working towards the other 3 criteria. With uncertain maturity, it means that this initiative is not fully credible or mature and may be too small scale or lack evidence of addressing other criteria. As you can see, we'll use these criteria to choose initiatives that align with our landscape engagement targets and ensure effective, transparent action. To get an initiative recognized for the purposes of setting a landscape engagement target, such initiatives must meet the following requirements. The initiative should cover a defined area like a jurisdiction, watershed, or other significant area. If not following these boundaries, it must cover at least 10,000 hectares. An initiative must contain at least 3 different stakeholder groups, and written collaboration agreement must be signed by all participating stakeholders. The initiative should have at least 3 objectives: one environmental, one social, and one other objective. Each objective must include clear, measurable milestones. A public action plan should outline how the initiative aims to achieve these objectives. And finally, regular progress reports must be published. These should include a baseline assessment of the ecological and social conditions, with at least one indicator for each goal. Should include results from at least 2 time points, a baseline and a more recent result, which are publicly available. And all results must be validated by an independent entity. Companies will need to perform a self-assessment of these initiatives, for which SBTN validators will require evidence. Depending on whether the initiative meets all, some, or none of the criteria, 3 scenarios are possible. For each scenario, the company will have to provide a list of documents called roadmap documents. In scenario 1, a landscape meets all criteria. If this is the case, you will need to provide a detailed roadmap showing how the initiative meets the criteria, including a baseline and metrics to track progress, as well as document how improvements in ecological and social conditions are achieved. If the landscape meets some but not all of the criteria, in this case, you must outline the steps that you'll take to improve governance and meet those missing criteria, including a detailed plan to achieve ecological and social improvements. Here, however, some documentation requirements may be less strict. And then finally, for an initiative that meets none of the criteria or a new initiative, for existing initiatives, you must provide a plan to meet all of the criteria. And for new initiatives, you must describe the steps to establish a new initiative that will meet those criteria. So now let's see how URSUS uses the maturity matrix. URSUS has defined 2 landscapes for engagement, one in Germany and one in France. After applying the criteria of the matrix on available initiatives, URSUS selects the 2 most promising. Both landscape initiatives meet most of the criteria, but they both lack a transparent reporting system. Following the guidance presented in the previous slide, URSUS prepares an action plan that outlines the resources and specific steps that the company will take to implement a reporting system for the initiative, together with a description of the activities that the company and other stakeholders will implement to improve the ecological and social condition of the landscape. URSUS, in collaboration with the local university and farmer cooperatives, plans for the implementation of a training program in France with the purpose of stimulating and supporting the implementation of regenerative agricultural practices. As such training program and other activities must be financed, URSUS includes into the action plan a robust investment strategy to ensure the availability of resources for implementation of the planned activities. But what should a company do if there isn't a landscape that meets the criteria for validation, or there isn't any landscape at all in the prioritized locations? Companies have 2 options at hand. A company can improve existing initiatives and present an action plan that shows how the company, with other stakeholders, plan to strengthen the initiative so that it meets the criteria outlined in the maturity matrix. As a second option, companies can establish new initiatives following best practice guidance released by SBTN and other network partners, such as ISEAL and CDP. Whether a company is engaging in a landscape initiative that is already mature or planning to establish a new one, the vision should aim to contribute to a range of activities that will reduce pressures on biodiversity and prevent nature loss, restore and regenerate ecosystems and address species extinction risks, and transform socioeconomic systems to tackle the root causes of environmental degradation. These efforts are crucial for ensuring thriving and resilient landscapes, which is the point of this target. Companies should develop a detailed action plan outlining the specific actions they will take within the landscape scale initiative, the impacts of the engagement, and the indicators to track and measure progress. Within it, they should consider committing to develop or contribute to collective actions within landscape initiatives, assessing the potential negative social or environmental impacts from their potential engagement in the landscape, and choosing appropriately aligned indicators to measure and track progress in their landscape initiatives. You'll find some considerations for target validation of the landscape engagement target on this slide, such as some of the information companies are required to gather and submit to SBTN for validation. Later on in this deck, you'll find a fully detailed list of the required documentation. At the end of the process, your company's target should be stated in the following form. Company name is engaged in initiative name and committed to a substantial improvement in ecological and social conditions by 2030. As you've probably noticed, the landscape engagement target is broad by design. This ensures that it incentivizes a broad range of actions that may be needed to improve social and ecological conditions in landscapes. The flexibility of the landscape engagement target makes it very suitable to stimulate the implementation of actions that contribute to the achievement of other targets a company sets, from climate targets to freshwater targets to even the other two land targets. So how can these objectives fit together? Companies engaging in material landscapes can collaborate with other stakeholders to halt the conversion of natural ecosystems. Large agricultural companies that are committing to the land footprint reduction target can dedicate freed up land to the achievement of broader landscape goals set by the landscape initiatives, and by framing action from broader ecological lenses, can ensure that unsustainable forms of agricultural intensification are not applied to achieve the land footprint reduction target. Landscape engagement and the other land targets can support companies in achieving their climate targets while avoiding unintended consequences that might arise from focusing solely on climate action without considering potential impacts on nature. By integrating climate and nature targets, companies can better assess trade-offs and find best solutions for investments in both areas. For instance, focusing only on climate might lead to planting fast-growing, non-native trees in biodiversity-rich areas to quickly capture carbon, which could harm water resources, biodiversity, and ecosystem resilience. The landscape engagement target ensures that restoration efforts, even if primarily for climate purposes, align with the needs of both nature and local communities in specific areas. There are also links between the landscape engagement target and SBTN's freshwater targets. Landscape engagement targets can be set alongside freshwater targets, creating synergies for the achievement of land and water targets in the region. Please note, in this case, companies should start by following freshwater guidance on model selection and stakeholder engagement outlined in sections 3.1.2 and 3.1.3 of the SBTN freshwater guidance. Now that we've covered all the foundations and key matters around the three land targets, let's look at what companies should do to guarantee a good quality submission of targets for validation, and how companies can communicate on those targets once validated by SBTN's validation team. After having gone through the methods of steps 1, 2, and 3, companies are now ready to prepare the documentation to be submitted to the Accountability Accelerator, which is hosting the validation service for SBTN targets. Once the targets are validated, companies can publicly announce them by following the SBTN claims guidance. Each land target has different validation requirements. In this and the following slides, we've included relevant information you should consider when preparing for validation. For the purposes of today's session, however, we will not be covering those in detail, and instead, we will jump to the next section on how to communicate and disclose your targets once validated. Now that we've seen how science-based targets for land contribute to a nature-positive future, Let's go through what these targets look like practically. The following are template statements for each target. You'll see in the no conversion target, the target is disaggregated based on direct operations, sourcing from producers are the first point of aggregation, or sourcing from companies downstream from the first point of aggregation. In the no conversion target, company target dates will be also disaggregated based on the commodity, whether that commodity is sourced from a conversion hotspot or not, and the sector to which that company belongs. For the land footprint reduction target, companies will choose either an absolute target or an intensity target. And finally, for the landscape engagement target, companies will commit to one or two landscapes where they have operational or sourcing materiality and where they commit to participating in the substantial improvement of ecological or social conditions. Moving now to takeaways and next steps. By setting science-based targets for land, companies will be able to align their own commitments to nature with the necessary speed and scale of action as determined by science and clearly communicate to their stakeholders and the public. A validated no conversion target will provide companies with science-based milestones to no conversion and a pathway to avoid the wholesale change of natural ecosystem to another land use, or a profound change in a natural ecosystem's species composition, structure, or function. Companies will know which business activities and which sourced commodities are linked or potentially linked to conversion and will be able to focus their future efforts on transforming productive practices and or ensuring the sourcing of conversion-free commodities. Similarly, by setting a land footprint reduction target, companies will learn what is their contribution, direct or through sourcing, to global agricultural land footprint. Companies will know which business activities and which sourced volumes they need to address to limit land footprint associated activities. They will have a science-based and time-bound pathway to reduce land footprint and alleviate pressure on remaining natural ecosystems. By setting a landscape engagement target, companies will have identified and engaged in one or two material landscape initiatives, identified partners, and defined collective goals with the final aim to increase ecological and social conditions at the landscape scale. The work done through Step 3 will generate a roadmap through which companies will understand the current condition of the landscape and will have a clear path for enhancing the maturity of the initiative and the delivery of activities aligned with the defined objectives and the measurement of the outcomes. This marks the end of our module. What are the key lessons you should leave with? Take the knowledge test and test your learnings from this module. A link to the test will be made available on SBTN's website after this module is released, and users will be able to take this test as many times as you need to pass and certify your understanding of each module. In the next module, we'll focus on Step 3, freshwater. The module will look at SBTN's methodology for setting these targets based on the assessment of freshwater use and pollution that companies complete during Steps 1 and 2, along with a prioritization of locations that directs companies to start with the places where nature needs it most. This module will mark the end of our current curriculum. I'd like to thank you all for joining the Science-Based Targets Land Train the Trainer event today. Again, my name is Craig Beatty from World Wildlife Fund. Thank you.